Namaste, dear friends, and welcome back again. In the previous class, we had looked at the different frameworks that I proposed to use to present this course to you. And in that context, we talked of looking at the first principles thinking approach, which is really about trying to dissect the different contexts or the different topics and try and understand each component within it. After that, we looked at the Anubandha Chatushtayam, which is a very Sanskrit approach to understanding any knowledge presentation. So there was the Vishaya, then there was the Adhikari, so the topic, the audience, and then the need, Prayojana, and understanding the relationship between them. Following that, we also looked at the systems thinking that is embedded in the cases of the Sanskrit grammar. And taking that forward, we looked at, the different reasons why and who should study Indian psychology. And I think we've built a case to try to understand what is the difference between the Western psychology and how can Indian psychology act as a complementary way of understanding human nature. And these two are not contradictory in any manner. So moving on to today's lecture, which is going to focus on the etymology of the term psychology itself. So the course overview, we'll go through the rationale for understanding for studying the etymology of psychology, then look at the evolution of the understanding of psychology itself, and look at psychology as a science and its implications. So what is psychology? As we've already seen in the previous lecture, psychology is the scientific study of mind and behavior, and this has been defined in the Dictionary of Psychology of the American Psychological Association, which is one of the authoritative bodies for determining the different standards of psychology as we are taught today. And as you see, it is consisting of the scientific study of mind and behavior. Therefore, the first principle thinking application in this definition would entail to us to understand what do we mean by scientific study of mind, and therefore the study of mental processes and behavior. So it is also the study of observable behavior. And when we combine this, we have a better understanding of human experience as a whole. So what was the etymology of psychology? Why does the study of etymology matter? When we go to the root of certain words, then those words reveal to us their inner meaning. And once we understand the inner meaning with which that particular discipline was conceived, it would help us appreciate the different dimensions that might have been lost in its more casual or more contemporary utilitarian formats. So coming back to the word itself, when we talk of etymology, in this case, we see that the understanding of the word literally shapes the definitions of that discipline. More so, modern psychology also has reduced the understanding of the term psyche and therefore limited the scope that the word originally offered. And once we understand the origins, then we see what are the lost dimensions that we need to tap into. So the etymology of the word psychology, it has Greek origins and it comes from the words psyche or psyche, which means breath, the spirit or the soul, and logos, which is also then becomes logia, is the study of or the discourse. So therefore, originally, psychology meant the study of the soul. There is a mythological connection to it because the ancient Greeks, they personified Psyche as a very beautiful young girl, and there's a lovely story of her love affair with the god Eros because she was so beautiful that Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, was jealous, and she then sent her son Eros, who's the god of desire and love, to try and tempt her away. And but he himself fell in love with her, but he had a condition with her that she should never see his face. But she couldn't resist the temptation, and other people were inciting her to break her promise. So she goes and sees Eros's face, and he has to leave her, and then she has to perform several tasks to eventually get Eros back again. So it's also the story symbolically of how the soul goes through the process of life, goes through the challenges of life, the loves, the desires, all of that in order to rediscover itself in its higher form with the object of its love and its divine origins in that sense. So it's also symbolically represented like a beautiful butterfly or a moth, which symbolizes the transformation of the soul because of the metamorphic nature of the butterfly itself. So therefore, the deeper meaning of psyche is that it is the breath or life and breath also is connected to awareness. So if breath leaves us, life ends. Therefore, psyche meant the source of life and awareness. In the Indic and Chinese traditions, they have equivalents in the concepts of prana and of ki or chi sometimes. Psyche was much closer to what we now call consciousness, and it was not the limited sense of mind alone. This also brings up the whole discussion of what is the relationship between mind and consciousness, which does become the subject of the study of psychology, and more so in its contemporary times. So, early meaning of psyche in the Greek thought, we see that it was the source of life and awareness. It is associated with breath and vitality and not restricted to cognition or behavior, which the modern definition has limited it to. Some early Greek contributors in this context are Thales. He's also known as the father of philosophy. He talks of it as the internal power that causes things to move or change. He was also a big mathematician, and he was a great observer of nature. So he says that one of the things that moves a lot of things is water. Socrates talks of psyche as self and psychology as self-knowledge as central to wisdom itself. Plato then talks of psyche or psyche as a triparte of the soul, where he says that it's divided in, it has three parts. So there is the reasoning, the rationality principle, and then you have the spirited part of it, and as well you have the appetites. And there is the rational self, therefore starts entering into the discussion of the psyche. Aristotle takes that further, and he calls psyche as the principle of life, and makes it more of an empirical object of study. So you can understand it from a rational perspective as well. Going to the semantic evolution of the term psyche, we see that the ancient Greeks regarded it as breath, but we see, as we have just discussed, it was not solely the breath. There was also the soul component in it, but the classical period really built on the idea of the soul. And because religion was dominant in Europe during that time, so the connotations of souls, morality got attached to the term. In the 17th century onwards, with the development of industrialization, etc., we see that the concept of soul was replaced by the concept of the mind in order to define the psyche. We have a few Sanskrit equivalents that you'll find very close parallels with these terms that have been given. So we've got the term prana, life energy, Atman, the soul or the higher self, manas or the mind and mental faculties, chitta, which means consciousness, mental substance, and chetana is pure consciousness or awareness. And we find in Sanskrit literature a huge range of terminologies that describe the different shades of consciousness. And therefore, Indian psychology again becomes very valuable because it offers us that full spectrum of terminologies, and we're just looking at terminology here to see how it gives us an insight into that particular realization of a dimension of reality. Next, we will look at the term logos and see how the meaning has evolved over time. So originally the word logos in Greek means word or speech, and we see how the secondary meaning can be derived from that, which means discourse or reason. And in a more contemporary context, it has come to mean science or the study of in a more academic setting. And these have epistemological impacts, which means that the way in which one goes about the study and how do we know psychology itself is modified by the different understandings of the connotations of the term logos. So logos implies a systematic inquiry. It also implies a rational analysis, structural knowledge, as well as discursive reasoning. Moving on to the concept of psychology as a whole in ancient civilizations, we see that the Egyptians, the Greek, the Indian, and the Chinese traditions talked about it in terms of the soul, and therefore the whole way of psychology was to inquire into the soul, mind, ethics, and self-knowledge. Psychology therefore was inseparable from philosophy. And psychology in the medieval thought, because of the dominance of religion during that period, it got integrated with theology and metaphysics. The focus was on soul, virtue, how do you lead a moral life, and the inner life was understood within the larger cosmic order. In Renaissance in the 16th century, the Croatian humanist Marko Marulic, he first used the Latin term psychologia in his work Psicologia di Ratione Anime Umane, Psychology on the Nature of the Human Soul. And we see from there on that the word psychology starts gaining currency. So we have the earliest preserved printed works featuring the term Psychologia were published. Then we have, in the 18th century, it suddenly became very popular. German philosopher Christian Wolff popularized the term through his influential work, Psychologia Empirica, Psychologia Rationalis, and these works, they established psychology as a recognized field of philosophical inquiry throughout Europe. But mind you, it was still a philosophical inquiry. Then as we shift towards modernity, we see that due to the scientific revolution that was taking place, this brought in certain changes in the way we looked at knowledge, ideas, etc. And the emphasis now shifted from belief-based systems to observation and measurement. And there was a gradual separation of this discipline from philosophy itself. That gave birth to modern psychology. So in the late 19th century in Europe, Wilhelm Wundt in 1879, he started the first lab for psychology in Leipzig University, where he performed the first experimental psychology. And this psychology was defined as a science of experience, something that can be measured, something that can be observed. The modern redefinition in the late 19th century, as you can see, by Wundt himself, was the shift that went from psychology as being a philosophical thing to an emergence as an independent scientific discipline. And the definition moved from the study of the soul to the scientific study of mind and behavior. And you can see that's quite a big shift in which a few dimensions of psyche might have got lost. So when we look at psychology as a science, here are certain implications. Science itself required certain features for it to be known as scientific. So we see there is empiricism, which means that knowledge from observation and experience, and the application of this would be the basis for research and experimentation. Then there is a positivism aspect to it, which focuses on observable, measurable facts. These encourage objective scientific study. Next, we have the scientific method, which means that you have to follow structured steps to investigate phenomenon, the core of experimental and research practices. I want to just make a small note here that we should not confuse science and scientific method. Scientific method can be applied to objective realities as well as subjective realities. And Indian psychology has made great strides in applying very structured methods in order to investigate the phenomenon of the subjective world. But coming back to the requirement here, the next one is the most important feature of psychology in its scientific temperament that we understand today. So it requires objectivity. So in order to eliminate personal bias, this would then ensure accuracy and credibility of findings. You see, automatically the subjective experience has been left out. And if psychology is not a subjective experience, then what is it? So these are big questions that come up. Operationalization defines abstract concepts in measurable terms. This makes psychological variables testable. Then there is replicability. So the results must be repeatable across studies. So these are key features of empirical science as we have it today. And this confirms reliability and generalizability. Then you have to be able to form a theory and a hypothesis. So the theories explain and hypotheses predict. The application of that is in the entire foundation of scientific inquiry in psychology today. Moving on, we have causality and correlation. So you have to show how one result emerges from a certain cause, or the effect is emerging from a certain cause, and that establishes patterns. So it helps us to distinguish between cause and association. And then this guides correct research design and interpretation, so that there are no assumptions, fallacious assumptions that we are including in this scientific approach to knowledge. Ethics in research is another important dimension of scientific research, where one has to ensure that the participants' safety is taken into consideration, and whatever experiment is taking place, it happens with their consent. This helps to maintain the integrity and also cultivate public trust in the scientific experimentations that psychology undertakes. This is very important, especially in today's world where people are becoming more and more conscious of their rights and their what they can participate in. They can even deny participation. But please remember that if you plan to conduct any scientific research on a human population, it is imperative to take their consent before you do it, because this is also important in the context of publication. If you have conducted a research on human subjects and not taken their consent and not cleared the ethical committees in your respective institutions, then their publication will not be very easily considered. So please keep these in mind if you plan to take up any kind of psychological study. And finally, we have the statistical analysis. The statistical analysis helps us to analyze and interpret data. And this helps to determine the significance and supports the conclusions that we have. So if you want to come to a certain conclusion about whether, let's say, a medicine works or not, you have to take a population of a certain size to make sure that the results that you are getting are statistically significant. Only when it is statistically significant that you can start implementing it in society itself. So this is just an example of how statistics starts playing an important role when you start looking at psychology as a scientific subject which needs measurable empirical data. And therefore, we see that the journey of the word psychology, it has moved from very abstract philosophical concept to a very rigorous scientific discipline. The etymology of psychology itself, it reflects the fact that humanity is evolving and an understanding of consciousness from ancient myths and philosophical speculations about the soul to a much more modern empirical investigation of the mind and behavior. Having said this, one cannot ignore the fact that in different cultures, the study of the soul also has been undertaken in very scientific methods. And Indian psychology has literally excelled in the quantum of documents that it has produced based on very, very rigorous experimentation in the domains of the inner being. The term's history in itself, so we started off this particular section with the question, why do we need to study the etymology of the term? And we see that the history tells us a story of how we came to scientifically study what makes us human. But the question that remains is, does scientific study cover the entire gamut or the entire scope of what a human being really means? And therefore, just to summarize it for you, we see that in the ancient period, people like Aristotle and Plato talked of it as the soul and self-knowledge, and it viewed psyche as a principle of life. In medieval times, Thomas Aquinas and other scholars of theology looked at it as soul and morality and considered it as being part of divine creation. In modern times, scientists like Wundt and William James, etc., they talked of it as mind and experience and looking at mental processes. And finally, in more contemporary times, as technology advances, neuroscience is becoming a more palpable way of reading what is happening to human mind and brain. Cognitive sciences are talking about brain and behavior, and the view of psyche is more of a functional construct. So, food for thought, having talked of psyche as from soul to mind, the prescription of the oracle at Delphi to Socrates was know thyself. This is also an oft quoted line in Sanskrit from one of the Upanishads where they say Atmanam Vidhi. It's a very, very popular idea, know thyself, because it is only if you know thyself will you drive better. It is only if you know yourself that you will construct whatever you do. You will develop everything in a more meaningful manner. So for these few words, here are a few references for you. And thank you very much. Namaste.